Welcome, and thank you for joining our monthly webinar. This month, we are featuring a case study titled, "It's Safer to Walk a Tightrope Without a Net, Enabling Truly Agile Cross-Functional Teams by Refusing to Build a QA Department." Some key takeaways you will have after this webinar will include why QA is a process and not a department or role, what a true Agile DevOps model looks like, how to embed acceptance of new process framework into your organization, tips on building a culture of QA, and the role of QA in this new DevOps type world. Some housekeeping items. During this session, please keep your microphones on mute. Questions can be asked through the GoToWebinar menu bar located under the chat functionality. We will answer questions at the end of the presentation, but you may submit them at any point throughout the session. In addition, at the conclusion of the webinar, you will be sent a survey. We truly value your opinions and feedback. If you have a few moments, we would greatly appreciate you filling it out and also providing us with any ideas for webinars you would like to see from the testing experts at the testing consultancy. Which leads me to this next slide. This webinar is sponsored by the testing consultancy, otherwise known as TTC. TTC is a global consulting firm that specializes in all things testing. We believe a successful digital transformation relies on having the right people, processes, and technology. As organizations shift from slow, costly, and high-risk manual testing to test automation with Agile and DevOps processes, they can find testing to be a bottleneck in the software development lifecycle. We assist our clients to make these changes by providing modern software testing and quality engineering techniques such as test automation and test design optimization, which removes the bottleneck and enables organizations to make the transformation from waterfall to Agile and DevOps. My name is Carla Hartman. I serve as a customer success manager in the North America's office of TTC. Most of my experience lies in marketing, and I've spent some time in marketing within the software, services, and IT departments. As much as I enjoy working at TTC, I will share a little bit about myself to humanize me and not just be a voice over your computer. Outside of the workplace, I spend time staying active through fitness, practicing yoga, and reading nonfiction. And now, drum roll please, for the star of the show, Nate Custer. In the next 40 minutes or so, you will learn from the firsthand experience of senior consultant Nate Custer on how to truly achieve best practices when moving from waterfall to Agile to DevOps. Nate is a thought leader, systems architect, QA automation lead, and developer of tools and testing. He is an avid reader, Scotch lover, and fan of the Manchester United Football Club. He will share the practical steps he took to build a culture of quality within an organization, as he highlights concrete steps you can take in your department to shape the culture of quality at your organization. Without further ado, I will pass it over to Nate to get this main event started.
Hi there, Carla. I think we've got it set up. Can everyone see the screen?
Yes, we can, Nate. Take it away.
Awesome. So thank you for introducing me and for doing probably a better introduction I'm going to do here. I've been an IT professional for over 15 years, worked in QA, QC practices for the last 8. You can read about that. When I tried to explain what I did to my family or relatives that weren't in software, I often would tell them that I worked with teams that were doing high-risk changes or really important software. My job was to build a safety net underneath them so that our developers could work with confidence and be sure that we weren't going to do any damage. It's that image of building a safety net underneath that high wire rack that is why when I saw Nick Walenda, it really caught my eye. So this is a picture of Nick. And Nick is famous for doing high wire stunts and high wire racks without any safety net whatsoever. And this was just counter to everything I thought and how I live my life. And I wanted to dig in and learn more. Nick said that his great-grandfather taught them that safety nets offer a false sense of security. In fact, he notes that he had an uncle who was doing a performance with a safety net who passed away because he fell, landed in the net, and then fell out of it. I always try to pay attention when something kind of runs counter to my expectations. It's usually a sign I can learn something. And so when I saw this, I wanted to dig in more. As I dug in more, what I realized was that Nick is actually obsessed with safety. He trains 6 hours a day and 6 days a week. He actually performs every measurement and calculation himself to figure out exactly how tense the wire should be. He doesn't trust anyone else to do it. He hangs from the rope for 30 minutes with one arm and then 30 minutes with the other every single day, because that's how long it would take to scramble a helicopter to come rescue him. And it got me thinking, what if the way I had learned to do QA and as a department that sat next to the development and was past work actually was providing a false sense of security? What would we do differently if we tried to deliver software with no safety net? It's a provocative question. And in 2013, I actually worked at a company where we tried that. I ended up staying at that company for 5 years. We did more than 10 major releases, a number of minor releases, and I can honestly say it worked. So this really is, this presentation at its core is a case study of what we did and how we did it. So to do that, we're going to go through a couple things. I want to talk a little bit about why we did it, why we were forced to make that choice. We'll talk about some basic assumptions I had and that kind of undergird my thinking on this. We'll look at the model in a bit more detail. We'll talk about some specific moves that we made and try and extract some key takeaway lessons from that. We'll talk about the big challenges that we had, and then we'll have some time for Q&A at the end. So let's look at why for a second. Why did we have to try and build and release quality software with no quality assurance department? I put this slide together to sum up where we were in 2013 because I think it's an important context. I'm not going to read through all these different things. What I can say to summarize them quite quickly, we were desperate. We knew we had to make a major leap forward. We were facing what sometimes they call the burning platform, right? You're on a platform, drilling out in the ocean, and it's on fire. There's nothing you can do but jump, right? It, in fact, is the safest thing to do. But we weren't just desperate. We were also attempting to make really serious change. I joined this company as they were partnering with a small company that was partnering with a larger company. And they were shifting from a model of a CEO/lead programmer to a full development team. The company was growing at a pretty fast rate, and they were bringing in management. I found this quote from Peter Drucker that summed up where we were. He said, "The change from a business that is owner-entrepreneur run and can be run with helpers to a business that requires management's a sweeping change. One can compare it to two kinds of business and two kinds of organisms, right? The insect, which is held together by a tough, hard skin, and the vertebrate animal, which has a skeleton. Land animals that are supported by a tough, hard skin can't grow beyond a few inches in size. To be larger, the animals have to have a skeleton. And yet the skeleton doesn't evolve from the hard skin. It's a replacement. So when Drucker says management is necessary when the organization reaches a certain size and complexity, and management, while it replaces that hard skin structure, isn't a natural evolution. we were making that molting change and growing into a new form. When I try to picture it, I go back to this beautiful chart from the Institute for Cultural Affairs. This, for me, provides a wider lens for how I see the entire DevOps or Agile or digital transformation. It views organizations in 4 phases. And what's important about what it does here is that it doesn't say one phase is better than the other. There are different challenges and risks, preoccupations that are focused on, and each phase of an organization is the best way to handle the challenges that it's facing, right? But we were attempting to make this change from a hierarchical organization, or phase 1, right to phase 3, that collaborative organization, with an agile and collaborative approach. If you'll note in phase 2, up here under skills, phase 2 is where quality control, planning, performance management start to become important skills for that organization. We were going to try and just skip right past it. When I joined, I initially joined for 9 weeks, and they gave me a list of projects to do, detailing all the things they hoped I could accomplish. And they actually laid out these 8 milestones. It's clearly an ambitious leap, but looking at this, it was obvious where we were and where we had to go required making a quantum leap forward. So this was a challenge in front of me, and they said, how should we do it? What can we do? To that, I brought a couple of core assumptions. Let me walk you through those. There are really 4, for me, really important assumptions. The first is that automation is good. We should automate everything we possibly can. My initial base was working as a sysadmin, and good sysadmins quickly become fans of heavy automation. I was working at a company that sold software for business automation in an industry. Everybody there thought automation was the answer. It's what we sold. So automate whatever we're going to do, automation was key to it. For some organizations that are transitioning to more DevOps styles, this might be a debatable point, but for us, it was obvious. The second thing that's important to me is that good quality assurance professionals are made, not born. Every time I've talked to a really good QA practitioner, I asked them about how they got where they are. And they always would talk about who they learned. They'd speak of mentors, of books they read, coaches, talks they listened to, lessons they learned. No one just said, oh yeah, I've just always been innately good at quality assurance. One of the myths I think we find is that there's a certain developer mindset and QA mindset, and people are born one way or the other. And my experience has been that skills around quality assurance and testing are something that anyone can learn if they devote their time to it, like almost every other skill. My third assumption is about developers. And this one I'll tell you internally, when I first presented it to some people that have been in the QA departments for a long time, this was the most controversial. I believe developers care about quality. This might be controversial for some of you, but what I realized when you think about it is testing will never, ever make a quality product. The only way you make a quality product is that the people producing it make a quality product. Testing will tell you about the quality of your product. It'll tell you how good it is, but it can't make it a quality product. That only happens if your developers actually care. Once you agree to this, what becomes obvious is that, say, well, if developers care about quality, why do we still have bugs? Why do they ship software that doesn't meet these standards? I'm going to suggest that's because they don't know, or because the structure in the organization doesn't allow them to actually deliver the kind of quality that they're hoping to. Any kind of high quality product you can think of, you'll find people who care about it, working back, who are craftsmen working on it. I'm going to suggest developers care about quality. My last assumption is about process. For me, good process allows you to scratch your itches. For me, I think frustration is a combination of a negative experience and the lack of ability to do anything about it. So good processes align that negative feedback, and there are going to be negative experiences and negative feedback that happen throughout life. I don't think you can completely avoid it. with the people who have something to do, who have the agency to do something about it, right? So if you ever had an itch on your elbow, you can reach it, you can scratch it. It doesn't really rise to a memorable event. But if you've had an itch in the small of your back that you can't reach, and you try and you try and you can't get there, you know exactly how frustrating it can be. In the same way, good processes align that feedback. Poor processes allow for externalized costs. So whenever I see externalized costs, or for someone to be able to add work for somebody else without having to do that work themselves, I'm cautious that this could be a problem. So what did we do exactly? Those are the assumptions. What's the model? I don't have a fancy title for it, but to sum it up, my view is that QA and quality assurance and quality control are processes, not departments. This is something, how we did this was that we said there's going to be one group that produces the software and gives it to customers. We think of the entire software development lifecycle as a single process, a single system, and we are all responsible for it. We're going to bring in some quality assurance experts who are responsible for kind of steering our quality assurance processes iteratively, but everybody on the team is responsible for deciding what we test, how we're going to test it, how much we'll test it, and also for doing the work. Yes, this actually means that I had senior developers doing manual testing. Let's shriek a little bit. But this is what worked for us. At the core of this, what we realized was that this model shifts the decision to ship or not ship the software to our business users. That we did this process, we talked to our business team and figured out what functionality we were going to provide. And then we came to them and said, here's what we've done. Here's what we know about the risks for shipping it at this time. And they make the call to release or not release. This may sound a little crazy or counterintuitive. Plenty of QA departments are structured thinking that they have a veto. My experience has been, even when QA departments have that veto, that veto is illusionary. It's a veto in name only, because they go up and they go to the big meeting with a list of all the problems that they've had, they found, and they say, we can't ship this. And a few of those get fixed, and some of them say, we're going to ship it anyway. It's more important. There's a bigger risk to our business if we don't ship than if we do. Dropping any claim of veto or control actually allows you to see things more clearly and to better understand the risks to the business, and that's the ultimate end, right? Writing software isn't a means, it's not an end to itself. It's just a means to get decided. Within this model, I tried to make our processes to have as little directive or standard as possible, and instead to let the team prioritize experience and learning. What that meant is that we didn't commit to a certain level of automation for new functionality when we wrote it. We didn't say that 60% of our code will be covered by unit tests, or 80%, or even 20%. We didn't say every functionality will have the top 10 highest priority tests automated, or it can't be merged. Instead, we said there's a level of testing we all agree is important, and we're going to do that manually or automated. And if we merge functionality without automated tests, we've committed to manually testing and retesting that product and that functionality every single release till it was done. So we got automation there. There were certain things that were really difficult to test in an automated way. One of them was two-factor authentication with the methods that we used. So we didn't do that. We just had a step in our release process to manually test two-factor authentication. It took us 2 or 3 minutes to test manually. It would have taken a week to try and write code, and it would have been really brittle. So the return on investment wasn't there. We didn't do it. So that's what we asked of the team and how we organized it. But just as importantly, we also made some promises to the team. We asked every developer to do a lot more work. We offered developers training and coaching on how to test software. I worked to ensure that every developer had an environment where they could test every single part of the product and could test it in any kind of situation that it might run in the wild. That meant that we used PHP software, so you could test it on any PHP version you needed to. The organization promised to make test automation a priority in the backlog and to assign resources to it, and they did. And we did a report for the entire company about what our QA processes were, what we tested, and what we didn't test. We showed them a scorecard of where we were and where we hoped to be in the next 6 months, and we sent that every single quarter, so we were accountable to them. Our tech support team knew that this was a functionality that we said we thought was pretty low risk and hadn't done much testing on. That kind of transparency made us an accountability to the entire company, really helped shape and drive our commitment to quality internally. So that's the model. Let's talk about how he did it. I want to look at kind of, for me, 4 key moments where we worked really hard to do it. The first moment happened quite early on. I showed you that 9-week engagement and the 8 milestones that we had set. They had actually introduced a bonus structure. So I would be compensated for every one of those milestones I delivered. And a week into the engagement, they came and said, hey, we didn't tell you, but we're doing a big targeted security release across all 5 actively supported versions. Do you want to test it? Are your test plans ready or not yet? And even though these test plans weren't done, I stopped and said, nope, let's get used to testing it. Let's see what we find. And I found blocking bugs in all 5 of those actively supported versions, even with the half-finished test plans that I had. Doing that slowed me down on completing my milestones, but it showed that we were all in it together. I wasn't just there to generate some stuff or just get paid myself. I cared about what the company got. Years later, when I talked to the CEO and our lead developer, this is where he said he felt like he could trust that this process would work, and that when I said we needed to do something, he could trust me. This probably my first takeaway. There's always going to be a gap between what you want to do and what you actually can do with the resources you have right now. If your approach to quality assurance is to say, we have to do X, Y, and Z, and we can't, if we can't do that, don't do anything, I think you're going to end up frustrated. Constantly the challenge to build an organization and a culture of quality is to pragmatically find what's the most important things to do right now and what can you live with moving on. If you don't ship software that fixes 7 bugs because there might be an 8th one in there, you end up hurting your customers. Everyone's got to be laser focused on what the end goal is. So the second key move we did was to build a unified dev and test environment. So when I joined the company, every developer was tasked with setting up their own dev environment however they wanted. And a new developer joined right after I did, and I watched him struggle to try and get it to work. I was building a reproducible environment for testing, which is really critical. And I pointed out that, in fact, this would work just as well as a dev environment as it would for him. I took time to put all the tools that would make it a great dev environment, to add debuggers, to add tracing tools, and to add all the functionality that a developer might like. And what I found was, once I gave developers an environment where they could actually test, they would start running the tests to see how things were going before it even got to me. Having an environment where everyone could work was really critical. And this brings me to my second takeaway, and that is solve adjacent problems and look for adjacent problems. These test automation projects or DevOps projects, every little one you do that makes your release pipeline smoother, less work for everybody, will have a challenge when competing in the backlog against functionality that impacts the business directly. If you can solve 2 or 3 of those problems with one step or one project, you're far more likely to actually succeed at getting it done and making it a priority for everybody. So don't just silo in on just your responsibility. I always call it bird dogging, right? Keep your eyes scanning from side to side and see if there are problems where something you're doing might help somebody else do their thing better as well. The third move was to move to a shared repository. So frequently, people like to have one repository for the product code and a separate repository for test code, and potentially even a third separate repository for all the DevOps code. And while there are some good reasons for that strategy to work, I found a shared responsibility, a shared repository creates the feeling of a single team more than anything else. It also keeps all your branching operations in sync with each other, right? So as soon as I put our DevOps code, our infrastructure as code in the same repository as the product itself, developers started looking at it and figuring out what it did. And once it was no longer magic that happened over there somewhere, but they actually saw the code, they started adding to it and fixing it, making it better. That's how you got that team building going. This is my third suggestion, and that is use test code as your vanguard. Part of the beauty of this model is that it broadens what you can consider a quality assurance practice. Most development teams have moved into including code review as part of their workflow. Is code review a quality assurance practice? I'd say absolutely. Is code review something that the QA departments understand or are holding teams accountable for? If you have separate departments, frequently not. When you put them all together and have a single team, you can view your practices holistically. When you use your test code as a vanguard, some of these static analysis tools or coding standards can be really hard to migrate to, especially if you have a very large legacy application with millions of lines of code. Trying to run some kind of code formatter there actually could break things. And you don't have a test yet to be sure and confident that you can do that safely. Starting with your test code and your infrastructure code and saying these will be held to a high standard. We'll follow all the coding best practices here. We'll do code review. We'll have tools that do linters and checkers. And getting your developers used to seeing that as part of their normal workflow is what builds the buy-in that this is going to be important to do in the main product itself. So putting your test code in the same repository and then holding it to an even higher standard than your main code is part of how we got the momentum and buy-in to move forward. The last one, and this is probably the most important one for us, and this is onboarding through QA. So about 4 months in, my boss told me we're going to bring in a new developer, and he asked what I could do to help him get up to speed. We developed a process for onboarding that started with the new developer joining, manually testing the product, walking through test steps, and updating these test steps where they weren't clear. A fresh face who has never seen your product before is the best person to tell you if your documentation is good or not, right? Because they can tell you with fresh beginner eyes, and they'll see things that you would skip right past because you know how that stuff works. It also introduced the developer to the product. Once they had manually tested the product, we would have them run the test automation. When they saw tests run for an hour and do what had taken them a day or two to do manually, they were convinced that test automation was a high priority. Once they were convinced that test automation was important, then we said, great, why don't you write a test plan and write some test automation? This introduced them to working in our product, how our code processes worked, how review worked. All that stuff got worked out before they were touching product code. And finally, we actually gave them a capstone project, something that was significant enough that they would have to break down a large thing into smaller tasks and work on them individually. This gave us a peek into their skill set and how they handled projects. We knew if they could handle a bigger thing or if they needed the work to be broken down into small bite-sized chunks for them. This is a critical feedback. And it also got the developer thinking of the test automation and the testing framework, not as some project out there, but something that they knew intimately that they had helped improve, make better. Once they had ownership of the test code and the tests, they were far more likely to maintain it and take care of it as they worked in the product itself. So my fourth takeaway, onboarding shapes culture. When you have a person that's new to your company or who's new to your team, or when you have a team that's transitioning from one way to a completely different time, this is the perfect time to really script carefully what kind of culture and behavior you expect. Because everyone there is looking around trying to figure out how this team operates. And it's a great point to, you're already moving. And since you're already trying to adapt and change, you're far more suggestible and it'll go much more smoothly. I'm a firm believer that onboarding through QA should be how every developer joins the team. I'm convinced it's fantastic. And that it gets them up to speed and gets them aware of the product and gives them that basic knowledge that help drive them forward. So about that mostly, I said we did this for 5 years and it's mostly worked. I've told you how good it is and why I'm convinced this is a great way forward. But let's look at some of those challenges. The first is that thing that every Agile team has heard over and over again when they come up with a great idea. It's on the backlog. So I go to my boss and say, hey, listen, we could do this and it would make our test run 20% faster. Isn't that really important? And it probably was. But even if I was right, is that more important than some new functionality for a customer? It's a hard question. This model requires the leadership who prioritizes the backlog to have a comprehensive view and to be disciplined about doing the kind of maintenance work and doing the internal tooling work that will pay off and have dividends over the long term. If your leadership structure can't see past the quarter ever, and every result has to pay off right away, you'll struggle to implement this, and this probably isn't the right way for you to organize your work. I talked about the experiment being done in 9 weeks. I went back and looked at how long it took, and there was stuff that we said at 5 years, the very start we wanted to do, and it took us 5 years to finally actually get it implemented and used. We got enough stuff there, and you can see that we made lots of progress in the first year, and as we got that progress working, we actually realized that there were other priorities that were more important than finishing off some of this work. The next challenge is, for me, that we make a chasm or sever kind of the classic development pipeline. So in many companies, there's a pipeline from tech support or alternatively business users who have build a deep knowledge of how the software is being used, who then join the testing team as kind of experts about how the software is being used. They learn how to test the product and think about testing and what's important there. They move to automation, test automation. They learn how to write programs and write code, and ultimately move to development. And this pipeline gives you a nice career progression. Every leap isn't too hard, and they've got skills that help them transition to the next one. And our model severs that manual testing link. We say everyone who comes on has to be writing automated testing, interpreting test automation, and working on the product. If you're on the dev team, that's the limit. It wasn't until the 5th year that we're actually able to cross this chasm and have someone jump from tech support into development. I'll tell you that since I've left, that first person, we did it, and it was successful. They've brought 2 more in from tech support on in. So another challenge is that this model puts your QA subject matter expert and embeds them directly on a development team. And it removes them frequently from a QA department or from these community of practice or places for dialogue. It can be draining. You've got to figure out how to connect that subject matter expert, that QA coach, with other people thinking about how do you do QA well, exposing blind spots, learning new techniques, all that kind of stuff. This is actually a reason that I became involved in the local QA meetup in Houston. So now I want to talk about kind of the biggest challenge. And this was the pushback I got when I presented this internally at TTC, and where I said, that's great, and I believe you that it can work for a small team. But how does that work at scale? The pushback was, and I completely agree, that the hardest challenges right now aren't around and the Agile and DevOps challenges aren't doing that for small organizations or companies that just use software as a service. It's doing these with large enterprises. What does it mean to have not to have one Agile team, but to have 15 Agile teams or 50 Agile teams? What does DevOps look like when it's not one product, but in fact it's 15 different products that all interact? Does this scale? Let's say first off, this case study and my model is not an argument to go in and or excuse to just demolish all the existing QA departments. When I started and at this company, we didn't have a QA department. And our choice was, don't try and build one, let's just move straight on. If you've already built a good QA department, if you set high standards and you're building quality software, the problem is just that the QA department and the way you're doing it is now a bottleneck to everything else you're doing. That's a different challenge. Our experience has been that frequently projects and IT departments start off kind of in the Wild West. They build they kind of add more control and centralization. They set high standards for quality, and they sometimes have these like quality centers of excellence who are there to enforce those standards, to point out exactly what really good quality looks like, and hold everybody to account. And then once you've learned how valuable that is and you understand what a high standard feels like and looks like, then you can start to release control and go to these more agile teams. For me, if you already built a good QA department and you're struggling to figure out what does it look like to continue to practice QA and provide actual assurance as you're going to these more agile and DevOps models, the core suggestion isn't get right with your QA department, it's to ask your team, what would you do differently if there was no QA department? And then to try and do that. It's to act as if they weren't there, not because you're going to get rid of them or throw them away, but because you do that. If you go back to that systems map that I talked about, I see a direct interaction between this kind of cowboy solo model we talked about early on, a waterfall software development, and an agile DevOps. And I think that you can kind of superimpose this waterfall and DevOps transition inside that systems map. What it tells me is two things. The first off is waterfall existed for a very good reason, right? It was not created out of nothing. It was created to address the problems of cowboy or solo IT processes, to deal with the Wild West and to civilize it. What we're dealing with here isn't about one's bad and one's good. It's about a different way of working and a different way of organizing. That means for testing, that testing has to go through those same kinds of lean models and lean conversions that every other process has gone through, that we saw that both influenced the Agile software model and the DevOps model as well. And it pushes the demand for test automation to be much, much higher, right? The only way that you can keep up in an Agile and DevOps world with a high level of testing is if you have test automation. So kind of the final question in scaling for me, and when I presented this at a Agile DevOps conference, there were lots of developers who nodded and went, uh-huh, or that's what my team does. And there were people that worked in existing QA departments who were really terrified. They said, are you trying to talk me out of a job? Where's my role in this? And I want to say really clearly, I think QA processes are vital. These processes are important. I've been working on them for 8 years, and I joined a consulting company that specializes in them because I care about them. I'm not saying no one should do QA processes, or that there isn't a role for QA subject matter experts. What I'm suggesting is that in this model, you're shifting from being a team lead or a senior QA expert into an internal consultant. You're there to help a team as a coach, as an advisor, as a mentor. You're teaching them how to do what they need to do better. For me, that becomes about building a culture of quality that goes far deeper. Fundamentally, my last role is what we've built. I mentioned that we've been going to a local QA meetup, and I brought the person that I had trained and made that jump from tech support in, and he sat there at the first meetup, and they asked all these questions about what should we talk about, and what are your challenges, and there were questions like, how do we convince people to write tests, or how do you deal with test maintenance and prioritize it against other stuff, and all of these, how do you keep up? All these questions that just for him were absolutely taken for granted, and that's for me the goal. This quote from Helen Hayes is really, really important to me. In the long run, what counts isn't just what the next generation thinks. How far an idea permeates the culture isn't measured just by the change in attitude, by what is taken for granted in the next generation. So we've seen examples in TTC where we've worked with large companies where year on year they bring these teams in, they help the dev team convert to a really agile way, and they take members from the quality assurance department and embed them directly on the teams, managed by the project management managers instead. What that meant is that the overall headcount of the quality assurance department has gone down, but the number of people working on quality has actually gone up. And they've been able to scale and move faster and achieve higher quality stuff because everyone's concerned about it and it's everyone's job. That's where I think the future is. That's what, for me, a real Agile or DevOps culture is like. Both of these models are based on thinking about products, thinking about holistic systems, and being responsible for everything. I think testing has got to be part of that, and it's got to be a single big unified team. So that's the core of the talk. If you want to talk to me more about it, these are my contact details. Drop me an email. I'm on LinkedIn. If you are crazy about testing, just like we are, or want to hear more about testing, the Testing Consultancy is a great site. I actually was following them on LinkedIn as part of learning what was going on in the software community before I worked here. It's a great resource. We put on a lot of webinars. I would highly recommend following us and learning more about it. So that's it for me. Carla, do you have any questions that we should talk about?
I just wanted to thank you, Nate. I think that was very informative, and I hope everyone on the webinar enjoyed this thought leadership piece. Next month, we will be sending out invitations shortly for our upcoming webinar on mobile testing, and we hope you'll join us then. Thanks again, everyone, and have a great afternoon.
Awesome.